First-person shooters embody the most overt kind of power fantasy. With that said, many an FPS campaign has been a right stinker. Because the genre is so saturated, many developers figured they could get away with the bare minimum. But which FPS story modes are the worst? Well, I'm here to tell you. I'm Jess from WhatCulture, and here are the 10 worst FPS campaigns of all time. Number 10. Call of Duty Ghosts. Starting off, we have the 10th entry in a wildly popular franchise. Call of Duty Ghosts remains the most widely hated entry in the long-running series, and this comes down to its universal lack of innovation. The game was already shaping up to be a real letdown upon its reveal at the Xbox One event, with the developers focusing on trivial features like fish AI and a SEAL team service dog. So we had an inkling the developers had very little to offer. When Call of Duty Ghosts arrived in November 2013, it successfully met those low expectations. Taking place in the near future, we follow the brothers Hesh and Logan as they fight to defend a devastated United States. The two soon join the Ghosts to take out the cartoonish villain Rourke, and the same shallow power fantasy ensues. It's by far the worst campaign in the series, with its ridiculous story and samey scenarios. Mechanically, Call of Duty Ghosts still plays and runs well enough, but at this point gamers were sick and tired of its refusal to improve. The disappointment was only amplified by the onset of the 8th generation of game consoles. The expectation to take advantage of more powerful hardware rang hollow from the outset. Number 9. Halo 5 Guardians. Halo is a household name as a shooter franchise. Its campaigns were always on point thanks to superb level design and enemy encounters. Even when the franchise initially moved to 343 Studios in 2012, there was never a campaign mode that was widely disliked by the fans. Unfortunately, that changed when Halo 5 Guardians showed up in 2015. Sold as a controversial battle between the rogue Master Chief and newcomer Locke sent out to hunt him, Halo 5 Guardians arrived on the Xbox One with the worst story of the franchise. It was poorly told thanks to endless exposition and badly written encounters. Much of the professed morally grey areas were found to be very misleading, as Locke and Chief's confrontation was a laughably bad sumo fight. It didn't help that the campaign's overarching design was far weaker than previous games, and there were few memorable moments to be found, with the campaign often boiling down to shooting galleries. The much touted 4-player co-op also fell short, as there was no difference between the different characters you could choose when starting a mission. The first campaign in the long-running series to fail with players, Halo 5 Guardians put 343 Industries on notice, and to this day, their reputation with players is rocky at best. Number 8. Destiny. From one sci-fi franchise to another, Bungie captivated millions of gamers for a full decade with the Halo series, weaving their major releases together with brilliant campaigns which made full use of the gameplay sandbox. After parting ways with Microsoft, Bungie would team up with Activision for their next big property. Destiny quickly became one of the most anticipated titles of the 8th generation, but the end result fell far short of the developer's pedigree. As one of the most expensive games ever made at the time, many were baffled at its failings. Destiny is a quasi-MMO that sees players take the role of nameless warriors looking to fight back against dark forces in a future galaxy ravaged by destruction. While it professes to offer a seamless blend between single and multiplayer modes, something was lost along the way. Bungie's talent for making great shooting remained intact, but Destiny's story and design were highly mediocre. A baffling step backwards for Bungie, which relied so heavily on defense sequences and hollow storytelling. All too often players were tasked with generic objectives and funneled down overly linear levels. While aspects of the franchise have seen some improvement since its 2014 debut, the original title still left a bitter taste for many longtime fans. Number 7. Medal of Honor Warfighter. Of the many cookie-cutter modern military shooters that lined the 7th generation, few were as roundly disappointing as Medal of Honor Warfighter. The once mighty series had been resurrected back in 2010, moving into modern combat in a bid to compete with its nemesis Call of Duty. This push continued in 2012 with Medal of Honor Warfighter, which ended up putting the series right in the ground. While its multiplayer was mostly unremarkable, the campaign was a real slog. As Tier 1 operative conservative preacher, you took on various armed operations around the globe while struggling to maintain a family life back home. Warfighter's campaign stood out for its mind-numbingly scripted scenarios. The game simply didn't trust the player to work their way outside of the regular objectives, so it funneled them through every single level, with no room for variation or experimentation. Whether you ran into instant death scenarios for pushing too far forward or taking control away from the player, the game was unbelievably restrictive. With its bland story and equally dull gameplay, Warfighter had very little going for it, and the franchise came to an end shortly afterwards. From here, full attention was placed on DICE's Battlefield franchise instead, followed by Danger Close Studios being shut down by EA. Number 6. Battlefield 3. Next up on the list is Battlefield 3, developed by DICE. As EA's premier shooter franchise, this third entry was tipped as the biggest release yet. With a solid base established by Battlefield Bad Company 2 the previous year, the 2011 release saw it go head-to-head with Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3. While it was certainly a masterful title when it came to online multiplayer, the game's campaign was a different story. At the time, it had become standard to include a story mode, but this was often left as an afterthought in favor of PvP battles. Battlefield stood out as one of the biggest offenders of that trend. As US Sergeant Blackburn, you're being interrogated by the higher-ups over a trio of lost nukes. So begins a recount of various events with different soldiers around the globe. It turned out to be horrendously restrictive in its design and a poor preparation tool for the far superior online modes. To many, it's still the worst campaign ever seen in the franchise. While the series has never been known for offering a compelling single-player package, the way Battlefield 3 took such a big step back from its sister spin-off makes it all the more disappointing. Number 5. Resistance 2. Outside of Killzone, another lesser-known FPS under Sony's banner was Resistance, developed by Insomniac Games. After anchoring the launch of the PlayStation 3, many had high hopes that its follow-up would deliver the goods. When Resistance 2 arrived in 2008, it appeared to be a bigger and better sequel in every way. Its online offering was especially impressive, with 60-player matches on console and an 8-player cooperative mode that had never been done before. Clearly, Insomniac was very ambitious in expanding in this area. The same mindset, though, did not carry over to the campaign. Aiming to fall in line with the common shooter formula, R2 featured a 2-weapon limit, regenerative health, and far more linear objectives. The result is a far less enjoyable mode. The story continues the operations of Nathan Hale as he attempts to defend the United States from an alien onslaught. Falling into the trap of trying to be like Call of Duty, Resistance 2 severely neutered its diverse arsenal and added on a ton of cheap deaths to boot. Outside of the large-scale boss fights, R2 is a massive slog. While it received praise from critics at the time, it's aged very poorly in recent years. Number 4. Aliens Colonial Marines. Now we come to one of the most notorious licensed games ever released. Aliens Colonial Marines was a dream project put in the hands of Gearbox Software. It promised to deliver the ultimate experience of the 1986 classic while also providing a fully canonized story that would make amends for Alien 3. Trailers and demos got the fanbase super pumped. Then once the game finally arrived in 2013, it was a disaster. It turned out that Gearbox had outsourced the game to multiple studios, lied about the title's content, and made some seriously baffling decisions when it came to immersing players in the wider setting. Taking place shortly after the events of Aliens, the player follows a team of Colonial Marines sent to investigate the missing USS Sulaco. Of course, things don't go according to plan, and the team ends up stranded on LV-426 in a fight against the Xenomorphs. What could have been the best Aliens game of all stood as a crushing disappointment in every way. Aliens Colonial Marines is a disgrace to its license, relying too heavily on combat with mercs alongside moronic xenomorph foes. Luckily, Sega did respond to the backlash and greenlight Alien Isolation, which, as we know, turned out to be a far superior title. Number 3. Haze. Developed by the now defunct Free Radical, Haze was another effort in the FPS genre on PlayStation that fell at the first hurdle. To this day, very few gamers remember it. At the time, Haze was the subject of much hype, with some outlets calling it Sony's Halo killer. It takes place in a future ruled by war. As Shane Carpenter, you join up with Mantle, a private military company who juices up their soldiers with a drug called Nectar. However, upon learning the truth of Mantle's corruption, Carpenter switches sides to join the rebel group, the Promised Hand. It's a worthy premise, but the result, of course, was disastrous, or it wouldn't be on this list. On occasion, Haze did offer some light enjoyment with the differences between the two factions, but for the most part, it was an utter mess. Brain-dead enemies, an atrocious story, and bland levels all conspired to ruin the experience. This failed PS3 exclusive featured terrible AI and massively wasted potential when looking at its two warring factions. What made it doubly disappointing was how many of the developers could trace their experience back to GoldenEye on the N64. The team knew how to make a compelling FPS, but fell so short when it came to the 7th generation. Number 2. Juke Nukem Forever. Next, we have Juke Nukem Forever, a game that spent too many years in development under several different studios. It was quickly consigned to the bargain bin on release. First announced in 1997, the 5th main installment had great promise at first. 3D Realms was looking to take advantage of new hardware and really push the series to the next level. What followed was the most infamous case of gaming vaporware. As the years rolled on and development changed hands, it became clear that the final product was going to struggle to meet expectations. Juke Nukem returns after a long absence to tackle an alien race that are hell-bent on taking Earth's women. Arriving in 2011, those who waited patiently for the game ended up being very disappointed. Juke Nukem Forever stands as a shooter that lacked impact in both gameplay as well as its wider design. Over a decade in the making, Juke's final adventure fell victim to the most generic of modern shooter trends. What could have been an old-school style romp instead became a title desperate to copy the competition, with some crappy humor as well, which might have landed when it was first worked on, but certainly didn't when it came out. It's now been a full 10 years since Juke's last major release, and the character's nowhere to be seen. Number 1. Rogue Warrior. Last but not least, we have Rogue Warrior, by far the worst entry on the list and one of the laziest titles in recent memory. It was patched together by Rebellion Developments and released in 2009. While the game had been in the pipeline since 2006, the game moved from Zombie Studios and changed its focus in the process. Upon release, it was widely panned by critics, having seemingly been rushed out the door with minimal effort. Judging by the game's voice acting and dialogue, it appears much of the budget may have gone towards hiring one actor in particular. The game's one claim to fame was the use of leading man Mickey Rourke, who voices protagonist Richard Marchenko. This real-life Navy SEAL heads behind enemy lines to conduct covert operations. Outside of its abysmal gameplay, terrible graphics, and weak controls, Rogue Warrior is remembered the most for its ludicrous use of foul language. As Rourke swears and romps his way through the terrible campaign, gamers were treated to an awful experience. It offered many a laugh to those who stumbled across it on the web many years ago, but that hardly matters. Loaded with expletives and janky gameplay, Rogue Warrior is the worst FPS campaign of the last 20 years, but let us know if you agree.